Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another episode of my memory series where I go over my personal story of playing everyone's favorite MMO back in the day. Sorry about the gap between the last one, but this is part 4 in the series, and in the last one we left off with a cliffhanger. So far, we've covered my early steps, some of the alts I dabbled in, and how I eventually settled on the Paladin, leveling a good portion as one-handed holy DPS, and then later Retribution. I joined a guild and I made some friends who I still play with today. But after a short absence, I came back to an empty guild. What happened? Well, they joined a raiding guild. Our guild was very tight-knit at this point, and at most we had maybe 10-ish or 15-ish people max, so definitely not enough for raiding. But when I logged in, I either got a whisper or a mail from one of my friends telling me the situation. They had their dungeon sets, did all of the dungeons, and they were ready for the next step, which was raiding. They all joined this big guild named Archaic, and when I say big, we're talking like 150 plus members, which just blew my mind back then. They were making a big push to raid, and I think they were taking in a bunch of smaller guilds, including ours, and apparently I missed some drama. As sort of an application process, Archaic took new members along on the Upper Blackrock Spire instance as sort of a trial run to make sure that we know what we're doing. Remember, this was back when UBRS was technically a raid at 15 members. So, while I was gone, they took my friends Zarg, Maver, and Liquid, and our guildmaster Lon on one of these runs. I didn't mention Lon in the last one, but he was one of our healers, and the way we ran dungeons back then as our original guild was very methodical since we died so much. So we'd pull as little as possible, wait for full mana for each pull, and things of that nature. But Archaic did things a little different. They ran this place several times at this point, and they sped through it pretty quickly in comparison, and did things like pull more than one group, pull when the healer is at about half mana instead of full, and so on. Apparently, this didn't sit too well with Lon, and there was some sort of clash of powers and a big argument, and he ended up actually getting really mad, and he quit. The rest of the crew kind of adapted and just rolled with it, but Lon refused to join, so I came back to sort of a mess, and a decision to join 3 of my friends, or stay in a now empty guild with my guildmaster. Ultimately, I joined Archaic because I now had more friends there, and honestly, I just wanted to try raiding since it sounded fun, and that's where you got the purples, which, as I've mentioned in other videos, were a big deal back then. Especially early on when everyone was coming from dungeons, and we all had just blues and such. Purples were huge and were sort of a status symbol back then. Like, whoa, this guy has no life, this guy knows his stuff. So, I messaged my friends, said I'll join up, and initially, they weren't going to let me in. The original deal was to take all of us, or none of us, since we were a team. Well, excluding Lon, I guess, since he left, but that was of his own will. So my posse said that if Show doesn't join, we don't join, and they buckled and let the best paladin in the game join the guild. Honestly, this was probably because both Maver and Liquid were healers, and Zarg was tanking, so we had a lot of leverage since those roles were always much harder to come by. Especially tanks in vanilla, since some of the fights needed like 8 of them. So, I had finally joined a raiding guild, but the catch was they wanted me as heals. At this point, if you recall, I was Retribution spec, and also broke, so I couldn't really respect a holy, and a good portion of my gear was of the bear, which was strength and stamina, so I wasn't in the best state for healing, but I wanted to raid pretty badly, so when they asked if I could heal, I was like, yeah, sure. Luckily, this was 40-man raiding, and back then they gave you a lot of wiggle room, and you could have people who didn't really know what they were doing, and you were still able to kill bosses. We scheduled our first raid though, which was the Molten Core. This was one of two choices at the time, with the other being Onyxia's Lair, as you may know, but we went with the Molten Core because the attunement was way more simple. You just had to run through the Blackrock Depths instance real quick and grab a stone, whereas Onyxia was a huge quest chain with that escort for the Alliance, so our first goal was the Molten Core, and when we weren't raiding, we were tasked with completing the Onyxia attunement. So, we all gathered in the Blackrock Mountain, ready for our first raid. I stayed in the back, trying to be as nondescript as possible with my DPS gear and build as a healer. I'd throw out like 4 heals, then run out of mana, and buffing since I was a paladin. If there's one thing I remember from my first raid, it was buffing. Paladins originally had these 5-minute buffs called blessings, and at first, you could only apply them to one person at a time, so with 40 people, you were just constantly trying to keep everyone buffed, and it was rough. We all had our little assignments, and we were just constantly cycling between 40 people with these buffs. But it was made a little easier later on with an add-on called Whispercast, which let players whisper the paladin for a certain buff, and then, with a click of a button, the paladin would target the player and buff them. So this was a lifesaver to say the least. And then later on, we would of course get the Greater Blessings, which buffed multiple people at once. I believe it was split across each class, so you did still have to cast it like 9 times, but it also lasted for 15 minutes, which was definitely an improvement. Now, you may say that it's inefficient to have it class-based. What if you have Restoration Druids and DPS Feral Druids? Well, the answer to that is back then, there were very few, if any, DPS Druids in the raiding scene, simply due to the balance. And this was true with most of the other classes. 90% of the raiding Paladins were Holy, the Priests Holy, the Mages Frost, I think. At least in the Molten Core due to the fire resistance that every mob had. So, these buffs being locked to classes was actually pretty efficient at the time, and it was just another quirk with vanilla raiding, as I've mentioned in other videos. So even just starting the raid was a hassle, and it seemed like it would take an hour to buff everyone up so we could start pulling. Mages could make like 4 waters at a time, so they spent half their time as vending machine duty. Warlocks couldn't use their dots because there were a limited amount of debuff slots. Only one druid and priest could have heals over time on the tank because they didn't stack. It was vanilla raiding in its purest form. But this was it, my first raid. Despite how cumbersome it seems now, it was an amazing experience back then. We were in there for several hours it seemed, and we did actually get a boss kill. There really wasn't a first boss in the raid since you could go multiple directions, but in general, people went for Lucifron first. As did we, and after many attempts, we did manage to beat him, using the word "we" here lightly because I was pretty useless. We took a screenshot, and we divvied out the rewards. Our first set of purples. Now, anyone who's played vanilla before knows that there wasn't any shortage of drama over loot. This was our first raid, so we didn't have the DKP system set up, so I'm pretty sure we just rolled for the drops. I do remember the warrior gloves dropped because there was a big argument over them about who was allowed to roll on them. They were of course for tanking, but the DPS warriors were rolling as well, so our shared victory was short-lived and everyone got all angry, and the guy who won the gloves ended up being kicked anyways, I think. That's one thing I'll say is, our officers didn't take crap from anyone. If someone was causing drama about something, they'd boot him with the quickness and laugh about it later. They simply did not give a crap, which was actually a good thing because they didn't take it so seriously. I was only an Archaic in vanilla, so I can't say for sure, but I think we were one of the only competitive Alliance guilds who didn't take things too seriously like some others back then, which made it way more fun in my opinion. I'm surprised I didn't get booted because I was a stinker back then. I remember I did get in trouble during the Christmas holiday. I'm pretty sure it's nerfed now, but back then you could buy these snowballs from vendors, and these would actually knock down people in your party. Not your raid, but if you were in the same party in the raid, it would work. At this point, I was friends with one of the officers, so I had him move me wherever I wanted to, and during the trash pulls and raiding, I would sit in the back until a caster is about to finish their spell, and then knock them down with a snowball. Okay, here's a good one for you. I'm telling you, I was a stinker back then, but there's also this jump to the molten core that was a shortcut. Instead of going all the way around and through that middle platform, you can instead just jump down to a little ledge down here, and then you heal up, and then jump down once more to this ramp right next to the lava. So there's a tip for you, for those of you out there who are gonna play Classic. But one time, I got one of the officers good. He was getting ready to make this jump, and I caught him. Pow! I caught him with a snowball, and he missed the ledge and fell to his death. He was screaming on TeamSpeak, "Who did that? Who did that? You're paying my repair bill." And I quickly sauntered on out of there and got out of Dodge before I could be found out. Like I said, I was a stinker back then. Well, I still am today, but not as much as back then. We were still serious when we needed to be, but it wasn't like a prison camp where you must absolutely follow certain guidelines, or you weren't allowed to talk in TeamSpeak or whatever. It really was a fun environment to be in. Definitely not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. There's some crazy shit going on in that TeamSpeak, which, if I were to go into detail, I'd probably get banned from YouTube, so I'll just get back on track here. So, our first raid boss was Lucifron. I don't remember the drops really, aside from the mic gloves, since there's some drama with them. A lucky few got purples, and we called it a raid. One boss down, 9 more to go. From here, we started to get a bit more structured and started using the dreaded DKP system where you got points for participating in boss kills, and you spent them on loot. We also set up rules for who can bid on what, to avoid as much drama as possible, and we were officially a raiding guild. We got a website, set up times for raids, the whole 9 yards pretty much. I think we'd raid 5 nights a week for 4-ish hours, which was pretty hardcore. That was a big commitment, but a lot of us were still in school and college and whatnot, so we had the time to spare. I want to say that my first raid purple were the Lawbringer bracers. I know it was our tier 1 set Lawbringer, and I want to say bracers because I remember running around naked in Ironforge with just my bracers on to show everyone how cool I was. I was pretty proud of myself. So, the early stages of raiding. We're progressing through the Molten Core, and I made a lot more friends. We also had our fair share of drama. Some of it was hilarious, and some of it just made you roll your eyes and facepalm. My guild was very entertaining for the most part, and we had a lot of fun with it, I thought. In the next one, I'll go over more raiding, more shenanigans, and maybe even wrap up the vanilla portion of the series. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.